The sleep epidemic started in the 1980s. And one of the important things about my belief system is I lived before and after. So I was actually alive in the late 60s, early 70s when Stanford Sleep Study Center began, and my generation would have been the first sleep studies that they did. So one of the important points is we started studying sleep very late. It's only really 50 years in duration. So I think when air conditioning, sunscreen, and moving indoors because of computers, and COVID just exaggerated that, when we moved indoors, our biology stayed the same, but our biology was created when we were living outdoors. One of the most important factors is vitamin D that we make when sun touches our skin. And as we've been encouraged more and more, and I was alive when the dermatologist came out in the early 80s and said, sunburn is bad for you. But over the last 40 years, that's become more and more and more exaggerated, so that the American Academy of Pediatrics says that your kids shouldn't be touched by the sun until they're 6 months old. That is not normal. Children that did well, who had a normal immune system, were strapped on mom's back and still outdoors, because that's the way we've lived. And if you count all the hominids, all the human-like walking upright, we've been on this planet for 300,000 years. That means we lived outside like every other animal. In the final analysis, D is just one of the things that affects our sleep. So there are multiple other wavelengths of light and energy wavelengths that affect our biology. And medicine is very conservative. They are very slow to adopt things. One of the fascinating parts about being a practitioner on the internet now is people have the opportunity to talk about their published articles, to talk about their thoughts. Some of it's wacky, but it turns out that there's a lot of basic science being done about energy wavelengths and how it affects our biology. And vitamin D is a very important part, because medicine has completely ignored this hormone, and they have misnamed it a vitamin. They've considered a nutrient that has some good and bad aspects. The good aspect is lay people can go and buy it themselves. They don't need a prescription. The bad aspect is that the medicine that I was trained and is still being trained is not understanding and viewing this chemical as the hormone that it is, and does not understand the importance of it. The science is phenomenal, and it is advancing at an incredible rate. The general clinician who's having to face the patient does not know about D, and have actually been somewhat brainwashed, especially in the last 5 or 10 years. The confusing part of this is that we have these names for things. When we have names for things, we then treat the whole group as though it's that thing, and we think we know about it. So this was called a vitamin. That means that for the last really 20 years, the prospective controlled trials, that means we have many, many articles showing that vitamin D deficiency exists next to 100 different diseases. These are called epidemiologic studies, where is there a correlation? If your D is low, are you at higher risk for diabetes? If your D is low, are you at higher risk for miscarriage? There are hundreds of studies. Those all show that vitamin D is involved in multiple organs in the body, and it plays a bunch of roles. Unfortunately, the studies that are done to help the clinician know how to use this chemical. So my job as a clinician is I read the science, I read the articles, but the very logical question they have is, well, if diabetes is associated with a low vitamin D, then you should be able to give vitamin D to prevent the disease.
Right.
Because if I make sure they never have a low vitamin D level, then they won't get diabetes. When they do those studies, they use a fixed dose. None of the hormones are using a fixed dose. For instance, if I said, Judy, you just told me your hair's falling out and you have these palpitations and you're in a really terrible mood and your sleep is affected, and I say, you know what? That sounds like a thyroid problem, Judy. Why don't you run on down to CVS and buy some thyroid hormone, and I'll see you back in a year. You would go, wait, my auntie got really screwed up when her thyroid levels were right. Aren't you supposed to draw some blood and see what my thyroid level is? Because every single hormone in our body stays within a maintained level. Too much is bad. Too little is bad. As we in medicine have started to use hormones as pharmaceuticals. So as soon as I make a thyroid hormone and I give it as a pill, as soon as I use testosterone and give it as a cream or estrogen, our patients come back and say, you know, I don't feel good in the following ways. That means the doctors actually learn that too low and too high are both wrong, that there's a normal, sustained, what's called homeostatic level that's maintained in the body. We're going to use these as drugs. We have to follow that same logic. So when I say this is a hormone to a medicine audience, so a doctor's audience, and I can try to get them to flip their mind a little bit, immediately they're going to know that you have to do blood levels. And it's the blood level that determines whether the person feels good or doesn't feel good. Also, because of their experience, if they are a general practitioner, they know that too high will give something wrong and too low will give something wrong. In contrast to that, the prospective trials are using the concept vitamin, which means that it's a public health issue. That means when they do the studies, what they do is they recruit 25. This is a very important study that was done and ended in 1999. They recruit 20,000 people, and they only do the vitamin D level in 2/3 of them. We recruited 25,000 people, and we published the study claiming that we studied all these people, but only 2/3 of them ever had a D level. And the mean D level was 30. That means that some of them had a D level of 50, and they weren't deficient. Others of them had a D level of 10 and they were deficient, but they never actually understand the concept that what you need to do. And unfortunately, there is a minority opinion within the literature that understands this concept clearly, that our endocrinologists and other people who have made this jump to it's a hormone. That means if you want to prevent diabetes using vitamin D, what you have to do is say, if I maintain my level between 30 and 40 over a 10-year span, or 40 or 50 or 50 or 60, will I be able to prevent this disease? That's what you must do with a hormone in order to get a good outcome. So the clinical trials that are giving everyone 2,000 IUs, but never doing a follow-up D level, never actually having the concept that it must be a level that's maintained. They're not stupid. They're not ill-intentioned. They're really smart. But they're running it as a public health issue where they're thinking, oh, this is a vitamin and we just give it to the public. And every other vitamin has a recommended daily dose. This does not, because it is a hormone. You can't give everybody the same thyroid hormone dose. You have to see how much they need and you follow up. So it's very helpful when I'm talking to a medicine crowd where I'm trying to get them to flip their thoughts, okay? The other problem is that D and vitamin A are very, very close in their physical structure. They look almost identical. Now, one of the important parts of that is humans made up the name vitamin and hormone, and they get stuck on it. Some of them are really things that we have to get from our environment or from nutrition, and vitamin A is one of those. But vitamin A also has actions like a hormone. Right. Vitamin A is also linked to our circadian rhythm because light comes through the eye, hits the retina. Retinoids, that's what A is. Retinoids then convert that photon energy into another neurologic signal that helps connect us through the brain into a 24-hour cycle. But there's a second chemical that's also light hitting the skin. Once you look at it that way, one's a vitamin, one's a hormone. We make the second one, the D, and we have to make it. Now we're going to talk about why it's confusing in a minute, but when we make it on our skin, then it's really not made and then stored. The word vitamin has been corrupted, and what we're told is it's fat soluble, which is true. And then the next step is we make it in the summer and we store it in the fat and use it in the winter. That is completely incorrect, because there is really a D level that is promoting activity. That's the summer level. In that place where my D is, and we'll talk about that later, I am building my body. I am going outside and I'm making things and I'm doing things and I'm putting all the calories I eat into making muscle. In the winter D state, when your D is lower, you are dormant. This is the same in plants as it is in animals. This exists on our planet in order to allow us to make it through the winter. So what do you have to do to make it through the winter? One, you like to put on weight in the fall, because if you have no food, because there's snow all over the ground and there's no food, you'd like to be able to exist on a lower amount of food. That means D is directly related to the thyroid hormone. It has receptors right in the pituitary. And the way we bring down our metabolic rate is to lower the thyroid hormone, which affects every cell in the body. And it brings us into this dormant state. We don't hibernate like bears do, but in fact, this was designed so that when we were actually somewhere where we're living in our little teepee and you got 3 wives and 10 kids, and you don't get out of that teepee except once a week, and you have 1 piece of dried food, it allowed us to survive. It allows every other animal to survive a time when there is no food. So I fell into this by accident. I was not knowledgeable in supplements, wasn't the least bit interested in D. I am a fanatic about sleep. That's what I'm interested in. Everybody in my practice who's seeing me, who I have now 2,000 sleep studies in these young, healthy people who are just seeing me for headaches, they're all abnormal sleep studies. And they all have low D. I had a real simple question. What would D and the D level have to do with this? And 2 people came back after I recommended some D and said, you know what? In about 3 weeks, my sleep was better, my headaches went away. So there was a clinical response to just adding D, and that led to a long, complicated path. First off, when I started to do this, I had no education. The literature was absurdly confusing. Even the names of the things, everything is called vitamin D. Accidentally, I bought a book that had 365 forms of vitamin D.
Oh.
Like, what? Those are all pharmaceutically made types of things with different. So I'm not an endocrinologist. I am a neurologist. I did not know anything about hormones. So the person that I followed at first was a guy named John Cannell, who was the first person to put a website up that said, isn't this the most ridiculous nomenclature you've ever seen? He spent a lot of time trying to understand it, and he was the guide that I was using. His comment was the 25OH is quote unquote called the storage form, and there's a transition between 25OH to 125OH, and you can measure both of those in the blood.
Yes.
Now, the problem is that in actual fact, if you read the modern literature, especially a guy named Slominski, which is ironically in a dermatology department, but this guy is a brilliant biochemist, he has shown that there is a rainbow of types of Ds that are made on our skin when we are outside. There are probably 20 or 30 types of D, that they are active in the skin and they are active in inflammation, and they have more than one receptor. There isn't just a vitamin D receptor. Everybody just stopped. Not everybody, Slominski didn't. And interestingly, D can be acted on by the same enzymes that act on the sex hormones, because D is made from cholesterol. And all the sex hormones are made from cholesterol. And the enzyme that takes pregnenolone to estrogen or testosterone, that enzyme is active on D, and it makes all these other Ds, and they can be measured in our blood. And he has shown what they hit, what receptor they hit. They're heavily involved in inflammation. What this means is most of the literature is ridiculously oversimplified. And the final message is we know very, very little about this chemical. Now, it's still important to us because your first question is, which is the absurdly normal question. Well, what's the normal level?
Right.
The answer is, it depends on what you're trying to do with it. But what I mentioned to you at first, which is really important, and you just reflected this, every single person who's using D has a level of physical symptomatology when it's better and when it's worse. My original question was very simple. And what happened to me was these 2 people came in and said, I took the vitamin D. My CPAP was helping my sleep a little. I took the vitamin D 3 weeks later. I started to sleep better and my headaches went away. 2 guys told me that in 1 week. So I go to the literature. I'm big into biochemistry. And what I put in is sleep and vitamin D, no hits. This is in 2009. No hits for that. There are lots of them now. So I put in brain and vitamin D, and I get to this guy named Walter Stump, who has 30 years of publications about where are the vitamin D receptors. And he showed back in the 90s that there are vitamin D receptors in all the sleep switches in the brainstem. So now I have not just 2 guys mentioning this to me, but I have a beautiful scientific study that shows these cells are listening for a D message. Now, in the background, the next question is, well, what's the right level? And I was just as confused about it as you are. And you know what? No one agrees on what the normal level should be, but I have 2 things to share with you. The first one is, I had a very simple question. What if we give D and we ask everybody, how's their sleep? Like, completely simple. I have all these patients that when you ask them, how's your sleep? The majority of them say, terrible, I can't fall asleep, or I wake up at 3 a.m. and I can't go back to sleep. Frequently, this population is young, healthy females who've had a couple of kids. They shouldn't have any medical problems yet. sleep disorders are extremely common in the mom and the kid. So the first question is, if everybody says over 30 is okay, well, why do these people feel so awful? Okay. And I just spent 5 years giving them CPAP if they had sleep apnea. The great majority of them did not have sleep apnea. They just didn't have the deeper phases, especially rapid eye movement sleep, which affects our mood and our memory. So these are important things that these women are coming in saying, I have a really bad mood and I can't remember anything. I'm having a hard time taking care of my kids. And all we say to them is, oh, you have 3 kids. What do you expect? Okay. No, that's not a right answer. So ultimately, I had a question. Is there a vitamin D level that would make my patients, who are otherwise healthy people, sleep better? So I would just send them off for a D level and they'd come back and see me every 3 months. And I'd say, okay, are you taking that D? And they go, yeah. And I'm learning what the doses should be. Because as you mentioned, each person needs a different dose. And then you have to arrive at a certain level. And then if the level doesn't really make sense for how the person feels, and your next question is, do they need a little more, a little less? And we're willing as a nutritionist, and we should be willing as a physician to have that conversation. How do you feel? Okay. Now, I didn't know how to do it. And I start with little tiny doses. And most of the time, my patients would come back and say, I feel terrible and my sleep is still awful. And I'm like, are you taking that vitamin D? And they go, yeah. And I was like, okay, you're taking 2,000, right? Yeah. And we do their levels again. Their first level was 28. And we moved, that was in the fall, and we moved into the winter, and now their level is 22. I'm like, wait, the FDA says 1,000 IUs. This makes no sense. It took me 2 years to get good with the dosing. And it turns out that that blood level that you're measuring is the leftovers. When you're really deficient, you take this in by mouth or in the skin, and every cell that's using it, like billions and billions of cells that have been very deficient, go, whoa, yeah. That means what you see in the blood is what didn't get absorbed into the cell. So it wasn't uncommon for the levels to go down, and everybody says they're not absorbing it. That is wrong. They absolutely are absorbing it. They're absorbing it into the cell. Now, the next step was we actually had a clinical observation where the patients started to come back and say, you know what? 3 weeks ago, my sleep started to get better. The other thing that I know that wasn't really common at the time was you can really trust a human being's claim about their sleep. They're not stupid. They've been living in this body for a while. They can tell you details about their sleep. They know when they feel better. So that actually started to happen as D crossed 60. So 60 to 80, and there's a lot about how do we tell what the upper level is. John Cannell said there is no upper level, there's no toxicity. And then I could swear that he changed what he said and said, yeah, there's no toxicity, but don't go over 80. And by the time I found that, I was feeling miserable and my D level was 90. And there's a long discussion about what studies we have. But ultimately, the biologic studies show that in a normal situation where you live outdoors all the time, you cannot run your D level over 80 just by sun exposure. There are also regulatory effects that break the D down so it doesn't even get absorbed. So there is a homeostatic mechanism that was studied actually in lifeguards early in the 60s. But 60 to 80 since 2009 has maintained as making a difference in a sleep disorder. Now, does that mean that that's the ideal level for D? No, it really doesn't mean that. Because what that implies is I have been so D deficient for so long that I have developed this really bad condition. And that probably means that my cell, what I have to do at the level is overshoot to some extent because they're sucking up so much D. If you look at the literature about what is the D level in hunter-gatherers who don't really even have a hut, and they've done those studies in North Africa, followed these guys around, published that, and shown that their D levels are mean. Keep in mind what I said about the mean level. The mean levels are in the 40s for the whole population. Let's say there's 85 people living in as a group. What that also implies is if you want to biohack with this, the question you'd like to ask that population is, who's the best performer? Who kills the lion? Who's the strongest? And what age are they? Because if you average in the 85-year-olds that are traveling with them, the other basic truth is, as we get into our 70s, our production of D from the same amount of sun exposure goes down. That means we don't really know what the ideal is. And I would claim that you really want to be careful with D. You should not biohack with it if there's nothing wrong with you. The 125-OH, that's called the active chemical, that you measure in the blood, has a very limited effect. It's being secreted in the blood. That conversion from 25-OH to 125-OH is done in the kidney, but that sluicing through the blood is going into the inside of the bone, and it's affecting bone metabolism and a few other things. But it has nothing to do with the nervous system, which is where I live. I want to know what's happening in the brain. And it's the 25-OH that has a carrier protein, like all hormones do, that floats around in the blood and then is transmitted over into the brain. It's also transmitted into multiple other organs that are not using that 125-OH. They are taking in the 25-OH, putting it in the cell, and they have the enzyme that converts it to 125-OH, and they make that when they need it within a specific range of what am I using this for. So that means we have an idea of what the blood level is, but in fact, we don't know what the brain level is. So we know so little that we have to err on the side of asking the patient to be an active participant in this program. That means I got into having a website, having a workbook, because I soon realized that none of my colleagues are interested. They are just brainwashed. You know, in the 80s, they said, if you have a good diet, you don't need vitamins. They just made this dogmatic statement that was probably somewhat true in the early 80s. But as soon as the D went down, D actually is one of the growth factors needed to have a normal microbiome. That means the epidemic of IBS and many, many of the inflammatory diseases that we're going to talk about next are all related to the fact that you lost your bugs. Now, having a good diet does not often cure the disease because you have to bring back the normal microbiome. And in order to do that, you must have D and you must have all 8 B vitamins. All of the other hormone measurements we do, whether it's estrogen, progesterone, thyroid, they have very specific molecular structures. You have to use liquid chromatography followed by mass spectrometry to have accurate levels. When you're doing that with thyroid or estrogen or testosterone, those levels are really important because you're correlating them as a clinician when you're sitting with the patient. Well, this doesn't make sense. With the D, none of the doctors know what the right level is for all the reasons you just described. Therefore, all of the labs started to move to immunoassays. You put a little dropper on it, it moves, colorimetry, etc. They are not accurate above a level of 40. They're very inaccurate. And when I was then doing D levels in my office, what I didn't know about was all this. I'm sending them down to the lab that happens to be in my same building. I'm getting all these levels. I'm doing that for 2 years. And then my colleagues who have their own medical practice decide they want to make some money from D. So they buy a D machine, and those D results, 20 points off from where the other, So if I say 60 to 80 is right for sleep, and my D level that was done in my lab through this LCMS was 60, and the other lab that the doctor just did, that their general practitioner did, it is 80, that's a huge difference. One of you go down, the other one you go up. Each person, then, the reason why we're doing levels at the beginning, it turns out, is so that the person can actually believe that this stuff that they can buy at the pharmacy, that a lot of their doctors say that's baloney, has a physical connection to how they feel. So that as they're looking at these levels and they have a sleep, or they have pain, or they have anxiety, or they have IBS symptoms, and we're following those symptoms, we're writing them down, and then we're looking at their level, and it's 35. And then the next month it's 45. And then the next month it's 55. And we're watching to see which symptoms remain and which go away. And then the next month it's 65. So the reason why there's a workbook is the hard part is I have to make that person really go through the exercise of what did I feel like on a D of 55? What did I feel like on 65? Were there things about my body that went away? For instance, I'm doing this originally with all these young, healthy females with daily headache. The weird part is you would think if they're spending all their time feeling miserable, that they would know exactly the date and the hour when their headaches went away. But they don't. They come in and they say, yeah, I don't have any headaches.
Right.
And they don't even go back and say, hey, this worked. They're so used to feeling crappy, and then I give them a drug and they feel better for like 2 years and then it goes away, that they're happy that they're better. But one of the most important parts that I've noticed is when whatever that is, X, Y, or Z, including sleep, when it goes away, we forget about it, but we're still concentrating on my toe that hurts. Okay. We are really designed. So the first part is learning that these things that we call vitamins are not really, this particular one is not really a vitamin, and it has really incredible power over your body. But if you're not noticing it and writing it down, you won't make the connection. Your question was, why would I need a D level? Well, here's what happens. First, your sleep gets better if we're successful, and your back pain goes away, and your menstrual cycle starts to be regular, and all these things happen to you. And then things start to get screwed up, and you don't really know if it went too low or if it's now too high, because they feel very similar. That means over time, the next step is, okay, these three things have come back. Let's do your D level and see where it is. And I want you to remember what it feels like. I'll use myself as an example. For the last 3 years or so, when my D falls from 63 to 58, I start to get a visual aura of migraine. I get this weird flickery thing that's like a quintessential textbook visual aura of migraine. And then I start to get a little headache after it. It's not terrible. In the background, I knew I had migraine, but the weird thing is my brain still knows the difference between 63 and 58, which is mind-boggling for me. Okay. Now, that doesn't mean that every single person needs to have a D level of 65. It means that I still tell people, look, if your body says X and it's different than what I tell you happened in 8,000 other people, your body is always right. Okay. So let's think about it in the proper way, which is these are the observation on all these other people. That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be the case for you. But the fascinating part for me has been that this observation has been relatively constant throughout. Okay. Now, there are other modifiers that you need to know about, but the reason why you need that is to say, okay, well, I just found out that my D level went to 85. And then you write down what the symptoms were that came back. Because then the next thing you do is to say, okay, now I have 2 data points. These are the symptoms I had when my D was too low. These are the symptoms that came right back when my D was too high. So then you actually have a level to go to reassure yourself that what I should do now is to go up or go down.
And so then if things get wonky again, and if we test that marker and it's within range, so then we can actually sort of consider that maybe it's probably not vitamin D and then consider other factors. So that makes a lot of sense.
I had this ridiculously medicine-based fantasy that D was the thing that was deficient and you're just going to give vitamin D. And keep in mind that I believe that even one hormones don't fix people. Sleep fixes people. Sleep is extraordinarily complicated. And what you're doing is you're repairing every single organ in your body. That is extremely complicated. Now, one of the things that I saw when I first started was all I had was CPAP. I just became fascinated with sleep. And I noticed that when they started to use CPAP, their diabetes went away. They went down to 1 hypertensive medicine. Their cholesterol went down. Well, the pulmonologists, the lung doctors that were assigned this problem because the nurses called them when they stopped breathing originally are telling us it's drops in oxygen. None of my patients had drops in oxygen. It's not that. It's staying in these deeper restorative phases of sleep. The complexity of what is happening throughout your body when you get into those phases is truly overwhelming. You're really mentioning all of it. Now, if you start with that as your final goal, 1, I believe that sleep is a better doctor than any doctor. In fact, doctors are trained to put a Band-Aid on a thing that went wrong.
Right.
The body is designed to keep anything from going wrong. That's miraculous. That means when I'm approaching it from that way, every time a person comes in with something going wrong, their sleep should be addressed. That means when I start to do these studies and the CPAP is not needed because they don't have apnea, and these are all young, healthy people, they're probably at the beginning of this. And everything about this is the brain. That means I start to look for the brain. And then I start wondering, well, what's happening in this part of the brain stem where those D receptors are? Why are these people not getting paralyzed correctly? That's really a neurologic problem. That's not an airway problem. So I'm thinking about it in a totally different way. And then I do D, and the D makes them better, everything I just told you. And then at the end of 2 years, after Walter and I published this article, everything falls apart. I'm like, whoa, I start to get this weird buttock pain. My sleep is a little worse because I'm thinking of the D as something that's pivotal to make repairs. Because I'm thinking about it looking through the sleep lens, okay? I'm looking at it in a different way. I'm saying, okay, we're sleeping better. I don't want them to be unconscious. They're not laying there like a lump. They're making repairs in their body. That means they'll need more magnesium, more calcium. They're making these repairs. They will actually need all more of the B vitamins. They'll need more A and more E, because every single one of those components that are pivotal for our cellular function, every single one of those, their need for them goes up. So what I discovered was that the D itself, although it is a growth factor for the bacteria, did not bring back the right bacteria. The IBS that they still had at 2 years, their lack of weight loss. So they were exercising, but they did not lose weight. This person brings me this stuff about the B vitamins, B5, and I start to read the review articles about the Bs. The authors at that time, about 2013, are saying, thiamine has a food source and a colonic bacteria source. Riboflavin, colonic bacteria source and a food source. Niacin, the same. Every single one of them has poop bacteria source and a food source. So I happened by accident to pick up B100, and I gave it to a set of patients over 1 week only, and with 400 milligrams of B5, which is the way it sits on the shelf. The way it was published in this book, the recommended dose for B5 was 400 milligrams. And by the end of the week, my restless legs was much worse. I was actually taking 500 milligrams of B5. And my patients started to come back and say, this stuff here, this pantothenic acid, this nearly killed me. I was so agitated that I only took it for 2 days and I couldn't sleep at all. I immediately had insomnia. It turns out coenzyme A is ubiquitous in all the food, but pantothenic acid is not. And there are all these articles from about the 1940s to the 1970s that really question that whole dogmatic statement. And in the last 3 years, there are now starting to be more and more articles published about 5 deficiency states in the brain that were found by accident. Okay, so one, when I was doing this, I was just completely blown away, because I was like, this is like this D stuff where the literature is completely wrong. But that's what we've been told. And since we were told, well, doctors don't need to think about vitamins or really pay attention, then we've actually had this move towards, I'm going to doctor myself, because the doctors don't know. So one, if you're profoundly interested in sleep, which is me, this one chemical, B5, when it's next to D, those two together make a neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. That neurotransmitter turns out to be very important. It runs paralysis in sleep. It runs our ability to transition through the phases of sleep. And it also runs our inflammatory system. It's not the only one. There are many, many layers to that, but it has its own way of affecting the immune system. It's called the acetylcholine anti-inflammatory pathway. It affects multiple areas of the brain. And there are all these primary science articles that are documenting that ADHD, which also started to be epidemic in the 80s, is related to lack of acetylcholine in the frontal lobes. And that autism has acetylcholine deficiency. There's a dose response to this one B vitamin. And the only thing I remembered from medical school was, if you give one B vitamin, you should give all of them. There's an article that beautifully done in a different way that shows that every single one of those 4 phyla makes at least one B and requires another B from one of its buddies. That was probably understood a little better in the 30s when they made these, arbitrarily calling all of them 8Bs, because they were all purified from the same stuff. And so I started to tell my patients, look, I'm thrilled that all your pain went away and your sleep is better, but if it comes back again, I want you to stop that B100, okay? Because I'm thinking, so there is now plenty of literature that supports this idea. One, the first article that supports in humans that D is a growth factor, establishing the less inflammatory microbiome, was published in 2020 in response to COVID. Then now there are multiple articles that are coming out showing this particular species makes this B vitamin. And this other group published in the same year I published the second article, which was, when D goes low, the microbiome goes bad, and that this is linked to heart disease, Alzheimer's disease, inflammatory diseases. This way of looking at it explodes all the recommendations, because it means if you made the recommendations in a population that had a normal human microbiome, that is really not the same as trying to use this to heal people. And then I just started to do D with them, and they would be back within 2 years with joint pain and bad things. So it became obvious to me that D by itself does not produce an illness, in my view. You get a low D of 35 every spring, okay? In April, you start to go out, you start to be in the sun. So the D was meant to go up and down. So maybe 35 for a month is no big deal. You do not lose your microbiome until the D is down in the 30s and below over sustained for years. And I make that conclusion, not because I measured it, but because the reaction in my clients is such that if you're healthy, you really don't have any of these complaints. But if you come into me with these complaints, I never really can get you fully fixed with just D. You really must get the microbiome back. When that microbiome is normal, so you have to take the B50, which is what I'm recommending now, because remember, I was on D for 2 years and then started to develop problems. That means I used up my B5 stores. There's all sorts of dogma about these are water soluble, we don't have stores. That's all wrong. We have documented B12 stores, documented C stores, documented B5 and B6 stores. There are scientific studies that really show that we have stores of these. When you don't have as much sickness, and that's the only way you can really measure the level of deficiency. How long has this person had an abnormal microbiome? How long have they been deficient in these 100 things that you're wondering about, just like I am? The clinical history is what will tell you that as a clinician. Unfortunately, most of the blood levels of all these minerals and the B vitamins, they're worthless. They're totally worthless. They have no relevance to what that person is experiencing in the nervous system. That doesn't mean it's filled all the deficiency states yet. So at that point, I personally wasn't taking multivitamins, but that is a pivotal part of my program now, because you really do need to supplement all these things. And iron is another big, big player in sleep and in many areas. Now we have articles that show that if you don't have the right bugs, your body really has lost a couple of the pieces that are the messaging system between the brain, do I need iron up here, and the intestinal lining. Similarly, zinc, copper, all of those minerals that have these charges, they're very, very incorporated into the bugs. If you don't have the right species, you can't do it.